Hello, everybody. Uh, Welcome to London. I'm sorry this isn't actually coming from the British Museum, but like everywhere else in the world, we're currently closed. And so instead of that, you're in my dining room, and we're going to talk lovingly about the British Museum, where I've worked for quite a long time. My name is Jill Cook. I'm an archaeologist in charge of the Department of Britain, Europe and Prehistory. My specialism is the archaeology of human origins, but I'm also very interested and teach about the history of museums, and in particular the British Museum collections that relate to my subject. So what we're going to talk about tonight is a project that's a part of the museum that I was involved in creating nearly 20 years ago now, and that's what we call Room 1, our Enlightenment Gallery, which is a beautiful graded one listed room built to house the books of King George III, which he left to the nation. And this glorious library was created, the books were moved in, but then, of course, in the 1990s, we built a new British library and the books moved out. And the museum was left with a Grade 1 listed building that we couldn't change. So our option really was, unable to modernise in any way, was to create a room which reflected the museum as it was in the 18th century. And as such, it's a microcosm of the whole collection from its origins to about 1820. And at that time, the collection was very different, the museum looked very different. And curiously, when visitors come back to the museum at the end of the month, one of the routeways that they'll be offered around the ground floor of the museum is very similar to the actual outline of the museum in 1759, when we opened to the public, having been founded in 1753, when, on the death of Sir Hans Sloane, his will offered the government the opportunity to buy his extraordinary collection for £20,000. To do this, rather than have everybody moaning that it was being taken from their taxes, the government held the first national lottery in this country, and the money was raised, the collection was acquired, and it took a few years until 1759 to open it to the public. And it was called then the British Museum, not because it was going to be a museum of British objects, but to reflect the fact that this was the first national institution that was founded after the suppression of the Jacobite uprisings in Scotland and the enforcement of the union with Scotland that had existed in treaty since the 17th century. So it's called British Museum because it was a symbol, a new national symbol of a united England and Scotland, not because it was going to include British objects. Next slide, please. Next slide. So here we are in the King's Library, the library for King George III's books. And this is the end of the room for which I was responsible. And the gentleman on the left of the image, the sculpture, is a beautiful bust of John Ray, who was a 17th century naturalist, a great naturalist, who was a mentor of Sir Hans Sloane, effectively the founder of the British Museum. And he looks on at an area of the Enlightenment Gallery, room 1, looking at geological specimens, fossils, bones, stuffed animals, bird skins, and of course botanical remains, herbaria, from which were Hans Sloane's particular great love. And this gallery, it's called the Enlightenment Gallery because the 18th century was such a period of discovery and investigation. It was not always an enlightened age. You must remember also that it was an age of slavery and exploitation. But for curiosity, it was a remarkable period. So from the geology at the south end of the gallery, we move through to looking at how antiquities were catalogued and newly discovered, organised, into the new areas of the world that were being discovered. Australia at the very far end of the room, but before that, the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, of South Asia and China. So in many respects, this room is a microcosm of the British Museum. And it's really what the museum would have been like in about 1820. Before that, it was rather different. Next slide. And natural history collections were very, very important in the earliest part of the museum. And the story I'm going to look at tonight is how this bone, which is a jaw of a mastodon from Big Bone Lick in Ohio, in the United States. And this jaw from end to end is missing a bit, and it's about 38 centimetres long, which is what, 25 inches. So huge, with a big tooth on it. And it's a reflection on the extraordinary interest that Sloane had, not in the great antiquities for which we're famous now, for Greek and Roman and Egyptian material, but for natural history. And this bone was sent to the British Museum in the 1760s. And it really tells a story of looking across the world and using the British Museum collections for the purpose that Sloane set them up. Next slide. This is Sloane here in a lovely portrait by Slaughter. He has in his hands his favourite work, a leaf from one of his herbaria, which was his great interest in life. By the time this portrait is painted, indeed, quite early in the 18th century, he had become quite a wealthy man by marrying a widow who, and she was the widow of a plantation owner in Jamaica. So her fortune created on the backs of exploited slaves, went to Sloane, and he was able to build his collection and sponsor work in a way that in his early career he could not do. Although never a poor man, he was the son of a land agent in Northern Ireland, and he came to London in the 17th century to learn how to become an apothecary. And his interest in plants really stemmed from that time. And his interest in animal remains and how to interpret them and identify them also came about at that time. Next slide. The collection that Sloane built up was in many respects very like other 17th century collections. London was a great port. The traders and he would go down to the docks and find what was coming back on the ships. So always lots of turtle shells in these collections, because on long voyages turtles were captured by the sailors for food, and they kept the carapaces to sell on when they got home. But you can see in this image of Ole Worm's museum in Copenhagen, Denmark, lots of natural items, swordfish, bones, a polar bear hanging from the ceiling, the fur costume of an Arctic person, fossils, shells, all kinds of things. Antiquities, not a bit of it, just odds and ends here and there. But the interest was in the natural world. In some respect, for many of these peoples, in God's creation. And that was the notion they had of their work, that was this was exploring God's work rather than God's word. Next slide. But at an early time, Sloane went to Jamaica. He had a remarkable time in Jamaica, recording some underwater archaeology, collecting gold from a wreck, recording objects brought from Africa to the Caribbean, recording the local Carib and African knowledge of plants and their how they could be used for human benefit. And this included things like cocoa for chocolate and quinine as a drug. So his interests were already showing even before he obtained his great wealth by marriage. Next slide. But before he went, he got to know in London a man by the name of John Conyers, who was an extraordinary fellow. He was also an apothecary. He remained in London through the plague of 1666 and the Great Fire, and his property was destroyed by the Great Fire, but he started again, and by the 1890s we find that he had a museum in his premises in Shoe Lane. Now this is Shoe Lane today in the modern city of London. The line of the lane is still the same. The buildings that Conyers and Sloanes would have known are long since gone, but sadly the great hopes of creating a London with broad boulevards and plenty of space, failed because of the property ownership. So the line of Shoe Lane is now as it was in the 17th century. And in Conyers Museum, Sloane will have seen objects on display for the interest of the public, and he will have discussed them in the coffee houses of the surrounding area about their significance. Next slide. And one of these objects that Conyers had found was this stone tool. It's what we call a hand axe now, with shaped from a stone nodule on both sides, nice sharp edge all the way around, slightly stained from the gravels that it was found in. Now we now know this hand axe is 350,000 years old, but this was an inconceivable time scale in Conyers' day, because it said in the margin of the King James Bible that the world had begun in 4004 BC. But Conyers and Sloane were curious about the fact that it was found some 12 feet down in gravels with remains of an elephant tusk. Now, Conyers absolutely rightly recognised that this was a tool or weapon of an ancient Britain. But what was the elephant doing there? And why was it 12 feet down in the gravels when the Roman remains and other things where you might have expected to find elephant remains in London were very much nearer the top of the ground? Conyers thought about this, and there are manuscripts in the British Library that show him trying to work out just what was going on here. They were digging in the gravels where the hand axe was found because they were putting the waters of the River Fleet into pipes, because since the 12th century the Fleet had been an open sewer, a health hazard and a big stink. And finally, after the Great Fire, with building work spreading out across London, they decided to put it into a culvert, and so they were digging down into the gravels. So here was this find, deep down, well below Roman finds in London, but there were only two possible explanations for it in that day. Next slide. One, that the bone was that of a giant. This is from Robert Plott's Oxfordshire, and you can see in the second line from of things from the top, stone objects and fossils which were described by Plott as the remains of giants, because there was no other explanation of big bones. But their written history, their source, the Bible, referred to giants, so perhaps these bones were the bones of giants. Next slide. And here, from 1664, from Athanasius Kirchner, who was a priest in the Vatican, believed he'd managed to translate hieroglyphs, but completely invented the translation. But Kirchner's books were an extraordinary encyclopedic nature. And here is his page of giants. The smallest figure on there is normal people, and the next one up is Goliath, as in the story of David and Goliath. And then you see the other giants from biblical sources translated into a scaled drawing to show that big bones found when digging foundations and so on were those of former peoples. But Conyers didn't think this could be right. Next slide. Because what he'd found with the Grazing Lane hand axe was a tusk of an elephant. So how could this elephant be there? Well, one possibility was that the Emperor Claudius invaded Britain. He had elephants in his entourage. And although Conyers didn't believe it, when the Grazing Lane hand axe was published in 1713 by John Bagford in an update of Leland's Antiquities, he said, well, this must be remains of an elephant that came to Britain with Claudius. And the fact that the hand axe is there is because the ancient Britons were trying to fight them off. Now, this was a big problem for Conyers and then Sloane, because deep in the gravels showed that this was a swiftly flowing river. The elephants would have had to have been on a boat. So it was all very puzzling and not believed. But the other idea was equally difficult. Next slide. The other idea was this was an elephant and humans that simply failed to get a ticket on Noah's Ark. And here's Kirsch's vision of Noah's Ark with the animals going in 2 by 2. And actually, if you look towards the entrance of the ark, it's actually elephants that are about to go in, with the birds on the top and the snakes and reptiles in the very bottom. Must have been a nightmare separating the lions and the tigers from the deer, but this was Kirsch's vision of how that might be achieved. Next slide. So those were the options. How could you develop a different story? Well, from Kirsch's book, you can see what limited knowledge there was of the anatomy of, in this image here, 2 little woodcuts, one of them an elephant holding up a tree and the other of a very strange looking camel. So this was the quality of reference material. So if you found a bone whilst digging in a gravel pit, what could you compare it with? Next slide. Sloane went about doing this by, first of all, gathering all of the written evidence and observations from right across Europe, from Leibniz working in Germany, from people at the court of Peter the Great in St. Petersburg, who had been to Siberia and brought back frozen mammoths from the tundra, from Steno in the Po Valley in Italy, where the same story of elephants occurring in the gravels of the Po were attributed to Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants. So always the explanation was from a written source. Sloane started to do something different. He started to collect the records of how deep in the gravels, where, what they were with, these bones were occurring. And he also went one step further. When a poor Indian elephant died in Kensington in London, elephant that had been bought from India and stabled, and Stukely describes the condition of this elephant as really rather tragic, and the people who went to see it were delighted and encouraged to hand it, to offer it bowls of beer, so that they could enjoy seeing the way it sups the ale up with its trunk. But sadly, a poor cold, wet diet of hay and beer did for this elephant. But it would not go to waste. Sloane bought the carcass and had it transported to his house in Great Russell Street, which is just along from where the museum is today, and got together a group of anatomists and physicians to dissect the elephant, and paid for all this. Heaven knows what the servants thought, that the master had had a dead elephant delivered, and a group of men were cutting it up in the back garden. You know, who's going to clear that up? But Stukely, William Stukely, I'm sorry, I just noticed this mistake there. It says S. Stukely, but of course he's William Stukely, was a wonderful draftsman, and he drew every stage of the dissection. Next slide. And you can see there one of his drawings. That's looking down. The head is upside down, and you're looking down on the elephant's palate and it's the surface of its upper molars with the skin flapped back, recording everything as they went along. One of the doctors present took away, it was a female elephant, one of the doctors took away the ovaries of the creature, and from his study decided that elephants must mate in the missionary position. And this slightly bizarre conclusion was printed in the first edition of Johnson's dictionary. But perhaps we should draw a veil on mating elephants. Next slide. So with all the, by dissecting the elephant and taking out all of the bones, there were then bones that could be compared to bones that were being dug up. And you could compare the size of it with a cow or a sheep or an elephant. So what Sloane is doing is building up a comparative collection so that people could tell when they found something in a geological deposit, they had bones with which to compare it. And when he became president of the Royal Society in 1726, the paper, his inaugural paper, was about his interest in elephants. Next slide. And includes on the right of this image the tusk that was found with the Gray's Inn Lane hand axe. He doesn't mention the hand axe because in 1726 it might have been regarded as a bit of a heresy, because he suggests that the elephant must, next slide, must date from a long way before the Romans, at a time when the climate was different, but there were still people in England. Now, this was a bit of a snag because the Bible says that the world was peopled by the sons of Noah, after the flood. And it was thought that the sons of Noah couldn't have arrived in Britain. So this, for those who were looking at the past through historical, biblical, written contexts, this was a problem. But Sloane avoids the question of human antiquity and opts for the antiquity of the elephant. Next slide. So by 1726, Sloane has collected all this evidence. He's facilitating the interests of others. He's paying attention in all of the accounts that he collects to the context and stratigraphy and the process by which these bones have been incorporated into geological deposits. And he's cautiously suggesting the nature of fossils, human antiquity, how the world has changed its shape and nature, and also that the climate in Britain must have been different at this time. So this is actually pretty groundbreaking stuff. Next slide. And already at just after the turn of the 18th century, there had been discoveries of huge bones at Claverack in the Hudson Valley. And similar bones to these were subsequently started to be found at a place now known as Big Bone Lick. And we've lost my arrow on there. But even on this map of Pownall's Middle British colonies of North America, the place where the elephants are found are clearly marked. And if you go down to the bottom left of the mark of the map, just above the O of Ohio, there's the arrow come on now, is where the elephants were found. So already that's being marked up on maps. And this is an extraordinary place where animals, all sorts of herbivores, congregated because of the salty licks. All animals, particularly elephants, love to have a salt lick. It's an important part of the mineral element of their diet. So the animals would go there, but because it was very boggy, they would get stuck in the wet ground and die off, and that would attract other predators, big cats and wolves and so on. So a huge accumulation of bones at Big Bone Lick, which is a national park nowadays, and was producing quantities of bone from the mid-18th century, which were being sent back to Europe in various ways. Next slide. The bone you saw earlier, the jaw of that we saw that's in the British Museum, was sent back by William Petty, the Earl of Shelburne, who was one of George III's main men on policy in America, and who travelled in America, becoming very sympathetic to the cause of independence, not so much in an American way, but in a very British way of saying, why are we wasting money trying to achieve a military victory and subdue and maintain these rebellious Americans, when what we really want is a booming economy and lots of trade. So let's just give in on independence and start building our relationship in new ways. So, and of course, when he becomes Prime Minister from 1782 to 83, he signs the treaty that achieves that. But while he's in America, he does acquire a number of fossils from Big Bone Lick, which he sends back to London to the British Museum and the Royal Society. Because in America, there's, next slide, there's great uncertainty as to what this could be. It's big. Next slide. And according to Cotton Mather, who is famous for his role in the Salem witch trials, definitely the bones of giants. Next. But for the curious and the, who wanted to know more, sending the bones to London, and some also went to Paris, was a way of thinking a bit more about them. In London, they were looked at by William Hunter, who you may know, he was a very famous anatomist and physician. There's a wonderful picture by Zoffany showing him at the centre of an anatomy demonstration, giving the class. And Hunter wrote a paper for the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, in which he realised that this was a huge animal, that it was not an elephant, because unlike the molar teeth of an elephant, which are flat grinders used for eating, worn down by eating rough grass in quantity, the teeth on the fossil sent back by Shelburne, previous slide. Oh, no, you've gone to the next. Okay, go back. No, previous. You can see are not flat at all, but they've got all these little pinnacles on the top. So Hunter rightly said, well, this is the size of a really huge elephant, but its teeth are not like either African elephants or South Asian elephants, or indeed like the mammoths found in Siberia. And because of the character of these teeth, these bumps on the top, it became referred to as mastodont. So masto, breast-like, for those little protrusions on the top, and don't for teeth. And he concluded that a creature with teeth like this must be a carnivore. Next slide. And the next. Thank you. No, back. Benjamin Franklin was in London at the same time, living in a nice terraced house not far from Charing Cross Station, really worth a visit. And Franklin also saw the remains both at the British Museum and at the Royal Society, and realised that this is some sort of big elephant, and not some sort of hippopotamus, as the as the French thought it might be, because of the huge tusks. But he also noticed that these tusks were very much bigger than those even of an African elephant. Some of them 2 meters, over 7 feet long, and of huge weight. So for an animal to have tusks like that, it must be huge. So here we've got huge, and Hunter saying that those pointy teeth are for meat eating, that this creature is carnivorous. Franklin wasn't sure about the carnivorous bit, but he certainly wrote about Hunter's finding to his friends in America. Next slide. And for a long while, it did go down as a huge meat-eating elephant. But very frequently, the tusks were put on the wrong way. So you can see them upside down on the top picture. Sometimes they're actually shown out, sticking out at the sides, instead of the other way up. So this is a completely invented drawing, but it does show the gnashers of a grinning carnivore compared to the bottom of the grinding teeth in the much smaller jaw of the modern elephant. Next slide. George Washington went down towards Big Bone Lick, surveying territories that they were hoping would be basically the next land grab. He didn't get as far as Big Bone Lick, but he met many of the traders and pioneers who were in the area, all of whom told him of the site, and he himself was able to gather his own specimens, which he took back to Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, just while he was writing the Declaration of Independence, John Evans took time to look at these remains and discuss them with Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was absolutely fascinated by them because of their size, because of their savagery, because they reflected a great wild wilderness. And he also couldn't accept that they might be extinct. This was troubling to him because he felt that if God created a world, he wouldn't let things just die out. So for Jefferson, there was a possibility that these creatures were still living somewhere in North America. So when he commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to do their great expedition west to explore and report back, Jefferson specifically asked that when they got towards the west, they started looking out for and inquiring about these giant elephants. Now, I mean, when you think about it, this is quite a terrifying request. You're pioneering routes that of areas only known to Native Americans. You're camping out. Imagine going to bed at night and hearing the slightest sound or rustle of the leaves of an elephant the size of a London double-decker bus heading towards you with the possibility that it could eat you. So Lewis and Clark must have been pretty brave about thinking this might be out there. But it's interesting that this was a question, because in the way the West was won and in the way the West was seen, that wildness and savagery, a wilderness to be tamed, giants to be brought under, but also animals that were absolutely unique to North America, something that was indicative of America and its ancient past, all became part of a myth, a really nationalistic, patriotic myth, which surrounded what was called the American incognitum, the unknown American. Before joining together to take their journey, Meriwether Lewis was commissioned to do some digging at Big Bone Lick, and the bones he found went into Philadelphia. Some went to Jefferson himself, and so the Philosophical Society in Philadelphia and the museums there also acquired bones of the American incognitum, which by that time were being hugely exploited and sent all over the world. Next slide. So as you can see, Lewis and Clark start slightly to the west of Big Bone Lick. So that stop off beforehand was a real reflection of Jefferson's great interest. So here, by the turn of the 19th century, we have a real understanding that there is a type of elephant that is only known in North America, that it is absolutely huge, and that it is extinct. And all of these things are American. They are uniquely American, very characteristic, as I say, of a wild West. This was the monarch of the wilderness, the largest of all known animals, and it was worthy of patriotic admiration. So all of the founding fathers and many others amongst the chattering classes were absolutely fascinated by this creature. Next slide. Still with its tusks on sideways, this is a drawing from Rembrandt Peale's hand, showing there, interestingly, look, a Native American with a chap in a top hat. I really, it's terribly British of him, but I do wonder how practical that was for touring America at that time. And it's compared in size with an Asian elephant here. So something, as I say, the largest of all beasts, but also something sinister. That here is this wilderness, here is this savagery. This is something to be conquered, and a myth of the wilderness, of the wild frontier, becomes an integral part of American nationalism, and is part of the rather violent conquest of the Western territories. So again, one sees this age of enlightenment not always being a very enlightened age. By the 1820s, the first remains of dinosaurs were being found in Europe, named by Robert Dinosaurs, which means terrible lizard, by Richard Owen, who was Superintendent of Natural History at the British Museum. In 1854 at the Crystal Palace, he created all these prehistoric monsters. And so finally there was something bigger and genuinely fiercer than the mastodon, which by this time was understood not to be a meat eater, but to be a woodland elephant of enormous size. But its teeth adapted to eating leaves and twigs rather than the grass of the African and Asian elephants and the mammoth. So by the mid-19th century, of course, the American incognitum is not the largest animal in the world anymore, but it still and always remained part of the great American myth. Next slide. Next slide. And understanding elephants and being able to recognize their remains became very important in the 1860s, when in excavating caves in southwest France, a greater understanding of human antiquity was achieved, and not only the bones of mammoths found in connection with tools and weapons of modern people living by hunting and gathering, but also these works of art. And this is perhaps my first love in the museum's collection, is one of the pieces of image making from that last Ice Age period, and it shows a mammoth which was part of a spear thrower until it broke across the shaft and was left in the deposits to be found and enjoyed at the British Museum today. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions now if there are any. I hope while you're thinking about your questions and typing them in, we will be opening to the public on Bank Holiday weekend, and you'll need a ticket, but as ever we will be free, but you'll need to get a ticket so we can control numbers coming in, and you'll be offered very nice routes around the museum to take you through some of our greatest treasures and antiquities. And I hope we'll see you back, both in the museum in October. We have Tantra exhibition and Arctic exhibition coming back, and lots of online events and lectures. So you can find those on the museum website, or you can become a member of the museum and keep up with us that way. And I hope we'll see some of you, and that one day this little talk is often a party piece that I keep for the 4th of July in the museum, that Mumbai, you'll come and stand by the fossil in room 1 and hear it as a lunchtime gallery talk when we finally get back to those lovely things. Have we got any questions yet? Ah, gotcha. Okay. Yeah, no, I can see Jerry from Kent in Ohio. Fantastic. How far are you from Big Bone, Nick? I wonder. You're asked, sorry, What area of Ohio did the mastodon jawbone come from? Are there other discoveries from Ohio in the British Museum now? Well, the Shelburne bone was from Big Bone Lick, and in fact, most of the things that came in the 18th century were from Big Bone Lick, which is a nature park now, and so yes, we have those objects, but also some Native American material that was also sent back in job lots, sadly often not properly provenanced or described. But so we do have a little material from that period from the Native Americans. The next question is, was Hans Sloane related to John Sloane, as John Soane, that's without an L, as in the museum? And is that museum part of the British Museum as well? It's an eclectic collection. It's a lovely collection. And it's not very far. It's about a half a mile from the British Museum, and but Sloane and Soane were not related, and John Soane's collection particularly focused on classical material. He was very keen on the Grand Tour, and and as an architect designed his house around the sculptures and mosaics and ceramics that he brought back from traveling through Italy and Greece. So rather a different collection, very different from Sloane's, which was that of a natural historian. But of course, Soane was one of the great and the good about town, encouraging interest in the classical world. So as you come into the 19th century, the nature of the British Museum's collection changes. Up until now, we've hardly had any antiquities at all. But at the beginning of the 19th century, with Belzoni's work in Egypt, with with Hamilton in Naples, with all of the work of the people who did Grand Tour and came back with things, work in Assyria, the British Empire incorporating South Asia and parts of Southeast Asia, Australia, all of those regions then begin to feature in the museum, and the emphasis changes from natural history to antiquities. And in 1884, of course, the Natural History Museum at South Kensington opens, and all of the natural history collection goes to South Kensington, which was called the British Museum of Natural History until 1984, its centenary, when it became the Natural History Museum. It dropped the British Museum part of its name at that time. And the superintendent and the first director of the Natural History Museum was Richard Owen, who gave us the word dinosaur. So no, they weren't related, but Soane's interest was very much that of the 19th century and the influence on how the museum changed at that time. Now, do items from the museum ever tour? Do you have exhibits in the States? Yes, we We lend more than any other museum in the world, all over the world. And of course, that includes the United States. And one of the great disappointments of the current epidemic is that it's held back a lot of loans, and it's going to make the whole process much more expensive. So yes, we do. It takes a bit of organising, but we're all set up to do that. And the main thing is to ask, and you'll be surprised what you can borrow. And sometimes we actually send fully formed exhibitions to tour in the US. So it's very much a part of our work that we love to do. What did the name Shoe Lane denote? Were they shops for shoe repair or shoemaking on this street? Yes, very probably in medieval times. The name certainly goes back well beyond the 17th century. So, and very often these names do come from the activity that took place on the street. Conyers lodgings were there before the Great Fire, when he lost everything, and he temporarily had to move to the Strand, but then moved back and had his little museum in Shoe Lane. Is Sloane Square, this is Barbara in Florida, is Sloane Square named after Hans? Yes, it is. And the Chelsea Physic Garden is also part of his estate. So yes, as I say, he became very wealthy because he married Jamaican plantation money, and he invested in his collection, in his libraries, in sponsoring the work of others, but also in his manor in Chelsea. And that's, of course, where all those Sloane names in that area, which is down behind Harrods, for those of you trying to place it. It's all of that was his property and is still part of the Sloane estate. Oh, very good question here from Patricia in Belchertown. How large was the tool or weapon found with the elephant remains? That's the grazing lane hand axe, and it's about 15 centimetres, about 7 to 8 inches high, and it's made of flint. Yes, this is Liz. Liz from Rocheport, Missouri, says that Meriwether's big bone lick bones were lost in water trains. That's absolutely true, Liz. There's a very depressed letter to Jefferson saying that he can't deliver his package of bones. They're probably somewhere heading for Europe down the Mississippi. But his digging there did effectively furnish Jefferson some, even though that one lot were lost in transit. From Jean in St. Louis, does the museum have a full mastodon skeleton from the St. Louis area? No, I'm afraid we don't. I'm not sure where the Natural History Museum mastodon comes from. I think that's a Hudson Valley origin. And Lauren in Ocala, where in the Hudson Valley were the bones found? I grew up in Poughkeepsie, I know the area well. Well, yes, there were a number of sites in the Hudson Valley, and indeed at least one site in New York itself. This site of Claverack is the famous ones, but as the British were up on the border with Canada, trying to make friends with Native American groups and Canadians, and just generally making a nuisance of ourselves. There were all sorts, if they were ever digging in anywhere or work was going on, these bones would turn up. So right through the Hudson, in the gravels of the Hudson, these mastodon remains do turn up. Art from Tucson, Arizona is giving me the full address for the Big Bone Lick State Historic Park, which is great. Thank you, Art. And Roberta from Beaverton in Oregon is asking whether Franklin ever saw the British Museum. Yes, he did. His house near Charing Cross is about 15 minutes walk from the museum. The area in between Covent Garden was at that time a bit dodgy because it was all molly houses and a bit rough. But if he avoided that and came up Shaftesbury Avenue, he would arrive at the British Museum quite safely. And he knew Hunter and a number of other people who regularly came in to use the collections, because this was what Sloane was aiming for. He collected all this stuff so that people could compare and contrast what they found with things of known origin. So if you knew these were the bones of an elephant, you could compare bones that you didn't know with those bones. So it was part of the raison d'etre. It wasn't just about entertaining the public or widening horizons. It wasn't just about educating. It was about researching. And sometimes people say that Sloane wasn't all that good because he collected all this data and didn't really analyze it. And he wasn't in a university, so he didn't teach anybody about it. But in fact, his legacy is from the fact that he provided comparative collections, that he set down the fundamentals of taxonomy and osteology and paleontology, by which the subjects could grow, by people coming into the museum, using the collection, comparing, contrasting, and then, like Franklin, talking to people about it, talking to people in France. Jefferson went to France and talked to Buffon with samples from America. Franklin was in Paris. So all of the savants in London, in Paris, in St. Petersburg were talking about these things. And this was the way that knowledge progressed. This was enlightenment. How did people at that time reconcile the age of the dinosaurs with the age of the earth according to the Bible? David from Orlando, that's quite a tricky and long story, David. By the end of the 18th century, it was accepted that the age of the earth was very much longer than the time span calculated from historical sources. So very much older than 4004 BC. from the margin of Genesis in the King James Bible. That was calculated by Archbishop Usher and by Sir Isaac Newton, from going back through the histories of Greece and Rome, going back through the New Testament, Old Testament, getting to those books where people lived till they're 800 years old and begat other generations. So by calculating, by doing the maths, Archbishop Usher, first of all, he was primate of Royal Ireland in the 16th century, and later on Isaac Newton did the same thing in the same way, came to the same answer. It wasn't just a matter of biblical fundamentalism. Isaac Newton did it to check the maths, and Usher did it from a very scholarly point of view. He was deeply concerned about the quality of the manuscripts he was using. He knew Hebrew and Greek and Latin, so he was a very critical scholar. So his calculation, which goes into the King James Bible, and Isaac Newton's maths check, are the world as it was understood then. But by the end of the 18th century, the great revolutions in geology show that the age of the Earth must be very much greater. And you have Hutton's wonderful phrase, no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. In other words, the way in which the Earth recycles itself through deposition and erosion is an endless cycle, and had to be very much longer than human antiquity. So by the beginning of the 19th century, the problem was, well, we can accept that the age of the Earth was hugely long, but human history, human antiquity, probably remains within that written framework. So it takes another 60 odd years until the 1860s really to accept the great length of human antiquity, which is of course not as great as the age of the Earth. And in between that come the dinosaurs, whose remains occur in geological deposits which are already understood to be very much older and therefore prehistoric. This is where the word comes from. They're not mentioned in the Bible, and therefore they come before that history. So, but of course, there are creationist museums near Cincinnati where that's presented in quite a different way. What did Lewis and Clark report to Thomas Jefferson as regards to the mastodon following their trip? They reported seeing, happily for them, no carnivore, no giant carnivorous elephant. Or any reports of it. In some Native American groups, there were, of course, stories of giant bisons and sloth, some of which were mythological, some of them which were possibly based in very ancient, distant memories of faunas that had become extinct. And Jefferson had to begin, he discusses with John Evans this possibility of extinction, and he's not sure about it, but as I say, Lewis and Clark report that they saw no mastodon and didn't find any reports of it. But of course, there still remain unexplored areas, so it's one does get the slightest hint that Jefferson might have thought that it might yet turn up. And certainly the American incognitum does fuel that Wild West, that wilderness, that savagery to be overcome with civilization and intelligence. So it's he doesn't quite give it up. Karen from Winchester. I'm not sure whether that's Winchester in the United States or Winchester in England. A relationship of animals found in France and the USA and how they got to their respective locations. Well, the other great patriotic thing about the mastodon is that it's only known in North America. This huge woodland elephant is very particularly an American species, and quite different from the African, the Asian elephants and the mammoths. Now, of course, mammoths also occur in North America, and they walk across when during periods of maximum glaciation during the ice ages, when the sea level is lowered, and so instead of deep water channel separating Alaska from Siberia, there is a land bridge, and the animals and probably also humans walk across there. It's not, you mustn't imagine that as snow covered, because of course with so much of the world's water locked up in ice, precipitation is reduced, and the Rockies acted as a massive rain shadow, snow shadow. So the Bering Strait is a grassy plain that the mammoths can munch their way across and get down into North America, and were in some respects contemporary with the mastodon, but because they're grass eaters and the mastodon need woodland, their areas, their ecologies are different, and so they don't compete with each other. And of course, mammoths are still in existence when humans arrive in North America, and probably helped the extinction of the mammoths there. No mastodon in Europe. How large was the spear thrower? Again, I don't know whether this is an American or an English question. The spear thrower, that piece is the weighted end of a spear thrower, and that's about 15 centimetres long. Again, you'll find it on the website. It's from Montestruc in France, and originally the spear thrower would have been about 50 centimetres long. So that's just the business end. The tail of the mammoth originally curled up, and that's what fits into the base of the spear so that it can be propelled with greater force and speed at the target. It's actually made from a reindeer, caribou antler, and so the shape of that kind of caricature shape of the mammoth is from the top of the antler. When the hook broke, they mended it by drilling a hole in the back and inserting a new bone hook, but then it broke across the shaft, and it was not repairable after that. Also, the holes that we perceive as eyes, but which are absolutely not in the right place for eyes, probably originally had coloured stone, so it would have been quite a personalised piece of hunting kit with beady eyes. There's one example from Masdezil, not far from Montestruc in France, which has one jet black eye and one orange amber eye. So they must have been really important pieces of personal equipment. So where are we? Yes. Who's this one? Gail in Seattle. Did they recognise the difference in mastodon feet and tusks? Yes, as the studies went on and more skeletal elements got in, the studies in the scientific studies in Philadelphia, as well as those in London and Paris, did gradually make those distinctions. You mentioned the limitation. Oh, this is Meredith from Olympia. You mentioned the limitations to dating created by the Bible. What was the key to expanding understanding of the timelines? Well, the key was the sort of work that Sloan and others were doing, bringing in comparative material, thinking about it, talking about it, and understanding that this wasn't a heresy to investigate like this, but having that permission that you were investigating God's work rather than God's world. This goes back to Francis Bacon in the reign of Elizabeth I, who gave us that wonderful phrase, knowledge is power. And Bacon advocated that the world be investigated, and that the investigation could never be heretical because you were looking to glorify the works of God through your understanding of them. But also, at the end of the 17th century, there was a very important book by Thomas Burnet called The Theory of the Earth, in which Burnet imagines how the world formed and how it would destroy itself. And it's a work which, you know, we look back at it and think, well, this is just pure imagination. But it was a very well read book. It went on being reprinted right through the 18th century. It's eulogized by Addison and many others. And I also think its popularity is, I always imagined this sacred theory of the earth would be an enormous book. And as I waited for it to arrive in the British Library, I was prepared with, you know, book stands and so on. And what arrived was about the size of a modern day paperback. And I think part of its popularity was due to the fact that you could sit back in your armchair and read it comfortably. Now, the importance of Burnet was that he was a clergyman, and he was a clergyman in the court of William and Mary after the Glorious Revolution of 1689. And in his first chapters, he says, it's okay to investigate and think about the age of the earth and how it formed, because Genesis is written as a metaphor so that the ignorant might have faith, but that faith is not undermined by knowledge and understanding. And in that way, this Protestant cleric, who's at the court of the king and queen, gives permission to look at God's work. So the 18th century starts with permission, but it gathers steam because of the likes of Sloan and his collecting, the slight changes in the Royal Society, where previous interest just in maths and astronomy actually spreads into understanding the natural world and geology and time. So, and it's that collecting and this gradual understanding, looking at geological deposits and saying, well, that can't form in 4,000 years. It had to take longer. And Hutton's wonderful phrase, no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end, understanding this constant recycling of deposits, of building and destructing. So understanding geological processes and geomorphology, all of that begins to fit together. It's not a linear thing. We often make a mistake in the history of science of seeing everything in kind of evolutionary terms as a long process of gradual improvement. It's not like that at all. It's much more of a patchwork. There's a quilt square there and there's a quilt square there. And for a long time, you haven't got anything to join them up. And then suddenly another part of the pattern appears. And so gradually, the picture on the quilt builds up. And that's really how the change of timescale. And in the present century, much the same thing has happened with understanding, distances and timescales across the universe. As methods of recording and observing have improved, and as methods of sharing through internet and so on have increased in speed but also in directness. So those things have changed. I think that's probably about all. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasant evening for me. It's suddenly become very dark here. I think we might be just about to get an enormous thunderstorm after a 34-degree hot day. And I shall think of Benjamin Franklin and lightning and electricity as that happens. Thank you very much for listening. I hope we will see you back in the British Museum and certainly back online with us as soon as we possibly can. Good luck to you all and good health. Good night.